Hello, I'm Mark Blechner. I'm going to speak to you today about the history of homosexuality at the White Institute. To prepare for this talk, I took a fresh look at many of the events of the last 100 years and the relevant scholarly documents, including some I had not found before, and I came to some new conclusions which I'm going to tell you about today. Also, in doing a kind of historical review, I came to realize that during the years 1992 and 1993, an amazing number of transformative events took place. I will be telling you about those, and we can wonder together about why there was such a concentration of special events at that time. I will try to cover several themes today. 1. What were some of the critical events and turning points in the attitudes towards homosexuality at the William Alanson White Institute? How did the theory of the relationship between personality issues and sexuality evolve in the 80 years of White Institute history, and what are our views today? 2. How did homosexuality of candidates affect their experience of training? 3. How did the clinical and theoretical attitude towards homosexuality interact with changes in societal attitudes? 4. What can we learn about the interaction of prejudice and psychoanalysis in general, and how does it apply to particular prejudices today, especially concerning transgenderism and race? And 5. How does our enriched understanding of Harry Stack Sullivan's life and his homosexuality change our understanding of the interpersonal theory of psychoanalysis and our approach to clinical work? I will start with that last question. Harry Stack Sullivan, the founder of interpersonal psychoanalysis and one of the founders of the White Institute in 1943, was a homosexual man. He established his famous ward for schizophrenics in 1928 at the Sheppard and Enoch Pratt Hospital that had an astonishingly high cure rate, and this brought Sullivan international attention. It was always known that the patients in Sullivan's ward were men, and that the staff was also male. However, there was more to it. In 1981, a psychologist in Maryland, Kenneth Chatelain, interviewed the last surviving mental health aides who worked on Sullivan's ward, and he published them in his book, Harry Stack Sullivan, The Formative Years. The mental health aides told Chatelain that all the patients on Sullivan's ward were gay men, and that the staff were also all gay or gay-friendly. According to William Elliot, who started working on the ward in 1929, Sullivan wanted to take care of the homosexual, knowing that they were homosexual, knowing that he was homosexual. Still in all, he was in the ring, but he wasn't playing. That's it. It's just like a ringmaster. You jump, but I'm not going to jump. And I think toward the end, he let the hairpins all come down. And this is it. Letting one's hairpins come down was an expression in the early 20th century that meant for one to reveal one's homosexuality to other homosexuals, similar to what today is called coming out. By the way, Chatelain never spoke at the White Institute. When I visited him in the 1980s in Maryland, Chatelain told me that he'd been scheduled to speak at the William Alanson White Institute before his book was published. But after publication, when people realized what Chatelain had discovered, the invitation was withdrawn. From 1926 to 1928, Sullivan did research on schizophrenia at Sheppard Pratt. He conducted 1,696 interviews with patients, which were transcribed. The transcriptions were supposedly kept under lock and key. But then a historian, Naoko Wake, came along. She was friends in school with the daughter of the head of Sheppard Pratt. and she got access to the transcripts of all of Sullivan's interviews. Naoko published her findings in her remarkable 2011 book, Private Practices, Harry Stack Sullivan, The Science of Homosexuality, and American Liberalism. We learned so many new things about Sullivan and how he actually worked with patients from Naoko's book. Sullivan spoke openly with patients about gay sexuality. He acknowledged the facts of his own sexual experience when patients asked him. He asked patients what they thought would be helpful or curative in a therapeutic ward. They made suggestions, some of which he followed when he started his therapeutic ward in 1928. That same year, 1928, Sullivan started a relationship with James Inscoe, who legally changed his name to James Inscoe Sullivan in 1937. Harry and Jimmy lived together until Sullivan's death in 1949. Jimmy died in 1984. Given that Sullivan was gay and was the founder of interpersonal psychoanalysis, you might expect the William Alanson White Institute to be more open-minded about homosexuality than other psychoanalytic organizations, which it was up to a point. I would like to mention, though, that Sullivan published many fundamental findings about schizophrenia and its treatment in a hospital milieu setting, but he never revealed in his writing or lectures that his ward was an all-gay ward. He also usually portrayed to the world that Jimmy was his foster son, not a romantic partner. In modern terms, you could say he was in the closet, though his homosexuality was hiding in plain sight. I will say more about this later. Clara Thompson was the director of the White Institute from its beginning in 1943 until her death in 1958. She was close friends with Sullivan and Jimmy. Sullivan heard Ferenczi give a lecture in New York in 1926, and he was so impressed, he recommended that Clara seek psychoanalysis with Ferenczi in Budapest, which she did. Ferenczi had more open ideas about homosexuality than most analysts at the time, which influenced Clara. Clara remained close friends with Sullivan and with Jimmy, although as far as I know, she never published anything that mentioned Jimmy's or Sullivan's homosexuality. In 1947, Clara published a paper, Changing Concepts of Homosexuality in Psychoanalysis. You see the first page of that paper on the slide. The paper was considered progressive in its time. Today, it reads as progressive in some ways, but it still keeps the idea that homosexuality is a pathology that at best can be eliminated. In the paper, Clara stated that when you work out the patient's personality difficulties, the homosexuality falls away. She wrote on page 183, Freud, in accordance with his libido orientation, considered unconscious homosexuality something basic and causal in neurosis, while more recent analysis has led to the conclusion that homosexuality is but a symptom of more general personality difficulties. Instead of being the basic problem in a given case, it is but one of the manifestations of a character problem, and tends to disappear when the more general character disturbance is resolved. And she said it again in the same paper on page 188. It seems certain from analysis in recent years that homosexuality is a problem which tends to disappear when the general character problems are solved. About 30 years later, Kohut came up with an idea similar to Clara's. Kohut said that homosexual feelings are the results of defects in the self, what he called disintegration products, and that when the self was healed, the homosexuality disappeared. As far as I know, Clara's postulate that resolving personality and character issues leads a homosexual to become heterosexual has never been tested empirically. Nevertheless, I know that it was taught at least until the mid-1980s at the White Institute by Ruth Moulton. Nevertheless, Thompson also recognized the ability of homosexuals to be good psychoanalysts worthy of respect. She wrote, "Moreover, we of this institute, the William Alanson White Institute, maintain that a man's capacity as a therapist will be adequately revealed in his work with patients, so that his supervisors will be able to judge. The reply to this statement is that there is no way of knowing whether a man is a psychopath, by which I think is usually meant a homosexual, because psychopaths are often good therapists." Now we will turn our attention to Bertram Schaffner, MD, who was one of the earliest, perhaps the first openly gay candidate for psychoanalytic training in American history. Bert was born in 1912. His brilliance was recognized in his youth, and he was promoted 3 grades above his age group. He entered Harvard at the age of 15, and then pursued medical training, specializing in psychiatry. He was drafted in 1940, and he worked on the psychiatric screening of draftees. He helped gay people whichever way they wanted. If they wanted not to serve in the military, he would give them an exemption without revealing their homosexuality. If they wanted to serve and he thought they could, Bert would let them through without revealing that they were gay. After the war, Bert conducted denazification interviews in Germany, including with the famous composer of Carmina Burana, Karl Orff. Bert was exquisitely attuned to the effects of culture on psychopathology. He was friends with anthropologists, including Margaret Mead, who wrote the introduction to his book, Fatherland, A Study of Authoritarianism in the German Family. Bert started psychoanalytic training at the White Institute in 1949, after being turned down by the New York Psychoanalytic and the Columbia Psychoanalytic Institutes. His training analyst at first was Clara Thompson, and the way the analysis went was a good example of her attitude toward homosexuality. She was open to gay people being trained in analysis, but she preferred if they eventually were able to enter a heterosexual relationship. Bert came to decide to marry a woman in France. He was scheduled to fly to Paris and propose, but the night before, he had a dream that he was in an airplane to Paris. The plane had no roof, and it turned upside down in the air. He took the dream as a warning to change his plans. He canceled the trip and the engagement, stopped the analysis with Clara, and found a new analyst. Bert had a combination home office on Central Park South. He had a large living room with a haphazard collection of chairs, and that room became the unofficial meeting place for gay psychiatry and psychoanalysis for over 30 years. In 1982, Bertram Schaffner helped found the Gay and Lesbian Psychiatrists of New York. I had the good fortune of being in psychotherapy supervision with him at the time. He was an extraordinary clinician, and he had profound insights into how culture affects the personality. Bert passed away on January 29, 2010, at the age of 97. I will tell you more about Bert later on. When I came to New York in 1976 after graduate school, I got to know a number of gay clinicians with whom I exchanged ideas. We knew that homosexuality was removed from the DSM in 1973, but we also knew that there was still a lot of homophobia in psychiatry and clinical psychology, and especially in psychoanalysis. In 1978, there was a great buzz. A recent graduate of the White Institute, Stephen Mitchell, published a radical paper in the journal Psychiatry entitled Psychodynamics, Homosexuality, and the Question of Pathology. Then, 3 years later, Stephen published another paper in the International Review of Psychoanalysis entitled The Psychoanalytic Treatment of Homosexuality, Some Technical Considerations. These two brave papers were thrilling for gay psychodynamic clinicians. Stephen questioned what he called the directive suggestive approach to working with gay patients, where analysts would subtly influence their patients to enter heterosexual relationships. He showed how the directive suggestive approach was fundamentally unanalytic, and he chided analysts who abandoned neutrality and pushed their patients to give up their homosexuality. When I started my psychoanalytic training at the White Institute in 1979, I expected these papers by Stephen to be taught and discussed, but that was not the case, at least in the courses I took, which surprised me. I was surprised even more by how people talked about Sullivan's sexuality at the White Institute. When I was in graduate school at Yale, the head of the clinical program was Jerry Singer, who had received psychoanalytic training at the White Institute. Jerry spoke casually about Sullivan being gay. But when I started psychoanalytic training at White, many analysts were saying about Sullivan's homosexuality, well, we don't really know. When I challenged that, one training analyst said to me, "Do you know any man that Sullivan slept with?" I was shocked by the question, but I decided to meet the challenge. What do they want? Pictures? Well, here's a picture of Jimmy that I think Sullivan had taken by a professional photographer. I also found gay people who knew Sullivan. Ellis Pearlswick, for example, was a gay psychiatrist from New Haven who had attended clinical seminars in Sullivan's home, which Jimmy co-hosted. He told me there was no question that Jimmy and Harry were romantic partners. Of course, since then, Naoko Wake has discovered a number of men whom Sullivan had sex with, including a student of Sullivan, Benjamin Weininger. Coming to the White Institute at that time was mystifying. In our classes, we were learning about dissociation and selective inattention, and those processes were front and center in the Institute's attitude towards Sullivan. It was like entering a psychotic family structure, where there is a big secret, and everyone is trying not to know, or act like they don't know, what is obvious. Alberta Shalita used to have her students read Ibsen's play, The Wild Duck. A family has big secrets. The father has syphilis. The daughter is walking around with difficulty since she is losing her vision. She has inherited congenital syphilis from her father, but no one talks about it. A man comes into the family and decides to tell everyone the truth. He thinks it will be a great thing for everyone. But the daughter shoots herself. The message is that truth-telling is not always a great thing. It can be dangerous, even tragic. Shalita was teaching us that you need to anticipate the effect of your words, and that otherwise, even with good intentions, you may hurt your patients or yourself. I took this lesson to heart and tried to find a balance between speaking the truth and not causing too much institutional anxiety. There were some exceptions at the White Institute about the mystification concerning Sullivan. Ralph Crowley had been supervised by Sullivan. Crowley said unambiguously that Sullivan was homosexual, and he was able to talk candidly and non-defensively about it. In 1986, Crowley told me this story. He attended a lecture of Sullivan's at a conference. At the end of the talk, Crowley went up to Sullivan to ask him some questions. Sullivan invited the young Crowley to continue the conversation in his room at the hotel where the conference was being held. Crowley told me, "We went up to his room and there were two single beds in the room. Dr. Sullivan lay on one bed and I on the other, and we talked and talked. I'm sure if I had been a little less square, he would have approached me." Crowley exchanged many letters with Jimmy Sullivan, who was witty and blunt. Here is a copy of one of Jimmy's letters. Crowley was working on a biography of Sullivan. In one draft, he wrote that Sullivan was cremated, and then went on to say that he was buried in Army uniform. And Jimmy writes back that it's hard to be buried in uniform after cremation. On September 27, 1972, Jimmy wrote to Crowley that near the end of his life, Harry said to Jimmy, "Jimmy, when I'm dead, don't be surprised if I'm referred to as that old homosexual son of a bitch." Here you see Earl Wittenberg, who was the director of the White Institute from 1962 to 1992. Earl was not favorably disposed toward gay people. In our first year class, Earl told us that he never went to patients' weddings, except in one case. The patient had been what Earl called a cruising homosexual, and Earl said he made him straight and went to the wedding. The attitude that homosexuality was pathological and should be changed was taught in several of my courses. Woody English taught a course in which each candidate did a clinical interview in front of the rest of the class. I interviewed a young gay man who seemed to be on the edge of a psychotic break. After the interview, Woody asked us whether the patient's homosexuality was treatable. Kathy White was in my class, and to her credit, she said something like, "I think this man has bigger fish to fry." In the introductory dream course, Lee Calligore presented a patient's dream that had defective plumbing in it. In a later dream, the plumbing was fixed. Calligore told us that the defective plumbing stood for homosexuality, and the fixed plumbing stood for the patient's acquired heterosexuality. Calligore continued to teach that dream example for at least 20 more years, until around 2003, when some courageous gay candidates protested. There are other examples. I would be interested to hear from current candidates in training whether this tradition persists. In 1992, Earl Wittenberg ended his 30-year hold on the White Institute directorship after what was known as the Revolution, and Mary Lou Lionels took over as the new director. In reviewing the history of homosexuality at the Institute, as I said before, I noticed that there was a dense concentration of significant events in 1992 and 1993. I cannot say to what degree this was a coincidence, the influence of world events, or to the leadership of Mary Lou. I can say that Mary Lou was a breath of fresh air at the Institute. She was open to innovative ideas, and she encouraged people to take chances. I will tell you about some of those remarkable events in 1992 and 1993. We'll start with AIDS. It's hard to capture how awful the AIDS epidemic was. The first cases I knew of were in 1979, and most of the people with AIDS were gay men. Those of us who were gay were referred large numbers of people with this terrible illness. The suffering of those with AIDS was enormous, and the government indifference to the epidemic made things much worse. It communicated that the government in general did not care if gay people were dying. None of us knew anything about working with a mysterious disease that was killing people in their prime of life. But we tried to learn from each other. Bert Schaffner created an independent study group for clinicians dealing with AIDS, which met for years at his apartment. It included several White Institute clinicians, but it had no official status at the Institute. Sandra Wilk, who was director of administration during the Wittenberg era, was one of the regulars. We traded insights from our experiences. It's hard to recapture how difficult that time period was. We in psychoanalysis were being asked to help people, often quite young, make the best use of their remaining time, which usually was about 2 years. I was getting many questions privately from White Institute colleagues about AIDS, so it made sense to make our discussions part of the Institute clinical discussion on a wider basis. To that end, I sent a proposal to Nat Stockhammer, head of the White Institute Clinic, on June 26, 1990, to set up a clinical service at the White Institute for people with AIDS, their relatives, and caregivers. I received no response. I think this is one of the main signs of systemic prejudice. Just don't do anything. I don't think the HIV service could be established while Earl was director. But in 1992, Mary Lou became director. That year, I gave a talk at the White Institute Clinical Meeting on Psychoanalysis and HIV disease. It opened up an examination of the psychodynamic issues raised by the disease, along with an exploration of transference and countertransference by all clinicians to their gay patients. During the discussion, Margaret Winkler suddenly asked, "Why aren't we as an institute doing something about this epidemic?" And Stockhammer replied, "Blechner has made a proposal." And that was how the HIV Clinical Service of the White Institute began. Here is a brochure from those days when we still used paper. And here is the reverse side, showing the people who had joined the HIV service. It was amazing how many people of all generations volunteered their time to work on this project, from candidates to older faculty. The HIV service was a real collaboration, and it brought together a group of people at the Institute who wanted to be a significant help to people in crisis. It also was a chance to open up theoretical falsehoods concerning homosexuality for discussion. It was a chance to discuss sex in general in an open way that I had not seen before at the Institute. Mary Lou Lionels, as Institute Director, was so generous and encouraging. She gave the HIV service the first Tuesday of every month for a clinical meeting for several years, and those meetings allowed us to learn and teach. We had Ron Grossman, an HIV specialist, teach us about the medical aspects of the disease and the psychological issues that were raised. There was a lecture on safer sex by Jill Rips, in which she took out a dildo and showed us the right way to use a condom. So many issues of gay life and transference countertransference were raised and discussed in a way that was new for the Institute. It became clear that the younger generation did not have the prejudicial attitudes of many in the older generation. People like Jean Petrocelli, Susan Bodner, Karen Marisak, and Ernesto Mujica showed themselves to be relatively free of homophobia and had progressive ideas about how to adapt psychoanalysis to people with AIDS and their caregivers. At each meeting, there was a confrontation of different points of view and real progress. Karen Marisak and Margaret Winkler led the referrals and were enormously generous with their time. We also held a major conference on AIDS in 1996. Jack Drescher led and organized the conference, and our keynote speaker was Matilda Krim, the founder of AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. As far as I know, no other psychoanalytic institute was doing as much as the White Institute on this front. In 1997, we put out an edited book, Hope and Mortality, Psychodynamic Approaches to AIDS and HIV. The book has remarkable clinical contributions that are still relevant today. Jean Petrocelli wrote daringly about erotic countertransference. Karen Marisak wrote beautifully about her immense attention to a man who was becoming demented. And Sue Shapiro wrote openly about her partial identifications with a heterosexual woman who was HIV positive. And we found a new closet. John O'Leary was running a bereavement group for gay men and realized that they presumed that he was gay too. So he had to come out as straight to them, which I think was a first. In 1992, Sheila Brown was elected president of the William Alanson White Society. She asked me to chair that year's academic lecture series on the topic Toward a Psychoanalytic Understanding of Hatred. The meetings were all exciting, but one stood out in particular. On November 18, 1992, we held a conference on the experience of hating and being hated. We brought together psychoanalysts who were Black, Kathy White and Sherry Ross, gay, Bert Schaffner, Jack Drescher, and myself, and a man born in Germany whose father had been involved with the Nazi regime, Georg Bose. We held the meeting outside the Institute at a larger auditorium, and about 600 people attended. It explored the similarities and differences between hatred experienced because of race, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, and other factors. It was breathtaking. After the conference, I submitted all the papers for publication in the Journal of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. We never got a response from the journal. Eventually, many of us gave up and published our papers elsewhere. York published his in German in a book called Aggression at the End of the Century. I published my talk in a book that I wrote, Sex Changes, Transformations in Society and Psychoanalysis. When Don Stern became editor of Contemporary Psychoanalysis, he found Kathy White's paper, Surviving, Hating, and Being Hated, Some Personal Thoughts About Racism from a Psychoanalytic Perspective. It was in storage. Don recognized how important this paper was, and he published it in 2012, 10 years after it was first presented. It's now considered a classic. When I then became editor of Contemporary Psychoanalysis after Don, I was given the record book of all the submitted manuscripts. I discovered that the manuscripts from our panel were never sent out for review. As I said before, this is one of the main signs of systemic prejudice. Just don't do anything. Now some more events from 1992 and 93. In 1992, the journal Psychoanalytic Dialogues, edited by Stephen Mitchell, published an account by Jeffrey Trop and Robert Stallrow of a man uncertain about his sexual orientation, who was treated by a psychoanalyst influenced by coca. The case had the supposedly happy ending of the patient embarking on a life of heterosexuality. The published discussions of the article by Stephen Mitchell and Arnold Richards praised the clinical work. The case was a clear example of the same old directive suggestive approach of trying to push the patient to renounce his homosexuality and embrace heterosexuality. Every time homosexuality appeared in the patient's fantasies or actions, the analyst interpreted the pathology of it, while heterosexual fantasies were encouraged and not rejected. The approach was blatantly skewed. 3 gay and lesbian psychoanalysts quickly wrote critiques of the article. One was Ronnie Lesser, lesbian candidate at NYU. One was David Schwartz, a psychoanalyst in Westchester, who gave his article the witty title, Heterophilia, the Love That Dare Not Speak Its Aim. The third was for me, Homophobia in Psychoanalytic Writing and Practice. They were, as far as I know, the first published criticism by openly gay psychoanalysts, 3 of them no less, of anti-homosexual bias in the clinical case report. Stephen Mitchell, to his credit, quickly published all 3 articles, along with a critique of his own positive assessment of the article. Yet another event. On December 4th, 1993, there was a landmark conference entitled Perspectives on Homosexuality and Open Dialogue. It was the first conference in history, I think, in which a number of openly gay psychoanalysts were featured along with heterosexual analysts, some homophobic, some not. The conference took place at NYU, but quite a few analysts from the White Institute spoke or were in the audience. I was given the task of summing up the conference at the end of the day. It was an amazing event. For me, the highlight was the presentation by Roy Sheppard entitled The Evolution of My Views on Non-Normative Sexual Practices. Sheppard had been involved in the 1950s in research about which signs on the Rorschach test could reveal someone's homosexuality. This had been a concern of many psychoanalysts at the time. Otto Pernberg, when he was still in Chile in 1957, published a paper on the topic. Here's the first page of that article. Now, 40 years later, at the 1993 conference, Schaeffer described plainly how most heterosexual analysts still considered homosexuality a pathology that needed to be corrected. Schaeffer described how his own views had evolved and changed. Schaeffer's wife, Rita Frankiel, who was trained at the White Institute, said during the discussion, "We analysts have to admit that we have committed atrocities on gay people." In 2019, the American Psychoanalytic Association formally apologized for their abusive treatment of gay people. But Schaeffer's and Frankiel's statements came more than 25 years earlier. Schaeffer's paper, along with others from the conference, were published in a book in 1995, Disorienting Sexuality, edited by Tom Dominici and Ronnie Lesser, who organized the conference. The NYU conference started a new format to have the openly gay analysts engage in direct discussion with the homophobic analysts. There's enormous value in this. Homophobia, like homosexuality, has to come out of the closet. Erroneous clinical presumptions of the past need re-examination in public. Much that has passed for clinical reasoning was a mask for personal prejudice. In 1993, the White Institute celebrated its 50th anniversary. Among the celebrations was a meeting in the Institute with Helen Swift Perry. Perry had devoted her life to editing and publishing Sullivan's work. She had written a biography of Sullivan in 1982 entitled Psychiatrist of America, The Life of Harry Stack Sullivan. Her biography was comprehensive, but she hedged on Sullivan's sexuality. Jimmy Sullivan told her that he had been a teenage prostitute on the street when Sullivan met him, but she did not put this in her biography. Although to her credit, she later told this fact to psychologist Michael Allen, who cited it in his article, Sullivan's Closet, a reappraisal of Harry Stack Sullivan's life and his pioneering role in American psychiatry. At this 50th anniversary meeting, we still saw the mystification surrounding Sullivan's sexuality, with much innuendo and disinformation. Aline McKay was there, and she asked bluntly, was Sullivan gay or wasn't he? First there was silence. There was no direct answer. Then followed the most disorganized, anxiety-filled discussion, with Helen Swift Perry telling a story of Harry and Jimmy sending her stockings for Christmas, implying that they were perhaps romantically interested in her. No one said, of course he was gay. My response was a paper on the gay Harry Stack Sullivan, which I presented orally at the White Institute in 2004 and in print the next year. I presented the evidence that Sullivan was indeed gay. But also, I went back to Sullivan's chapter on male adolescence in his book, Personal Psychopathology. That chapter ends with a detailed discussion of sexual practices among gay men. Sullivan uses strange terms, words that seem to be derived from Greek, Latin, or German. I asked Milt Zaparopoulos, who spoke fluent Greek and loved words, if he could explain the terms to me, and he said he didn't know. So I used the dictionary, the internet, and Magnus Hirschfeld's German sexology books to figure out some of the terms Sullivan used. Kukisma meant anal sex. Thorophagic meant swallowing semen. Stomixis meant oral sex, and synstomixis meant mutual oral sex, known colloquially as 69. I think this section is unique in Sullivan's writings because it spoke about homosexuality so bluntly, even though the language was so covert. It represented a breakout in the way Sullivan expressed his relation to sex in print. That may be one of the reasons his colleagues convinced him not to publish the book during his lifetime. But he used the text in a course he co-taught with Sapir at Yale in the early 1930s, and we don't know how the students in that class dealt with the text. Sullivan also never published the fact that his ward was gay. He told his friend Clifton Reed that he only alluded to it in a footnote. I think the closest he came was a paper on his theory of the relation between homosexuality and schizophrenia entitled Archaic Sexual Culture and Schizophrenia, which Sullivan presented in London at a Congress of the World League for Sexual Reform in 1929. Here, among other things, he suggested that homosexual experiences are much more common among American men than usually believed. And this was 20 years before Kinsey reported that 37% of American men had had some sexual experience with another man. Sullivan's strategy was consistent. He published his findings about schizophrenia, about milieu therapy, the psychodynamics of psychosis, and effective psychiatric interviewing, all of which had enormous influence. He knew that if he revealed that the patients and staff were gay, most people would not take his general psychiatric findings seriously, so he did not mention it. And I think the strategy worked. And then he was able later in his career to expand on this. From his findings about the effect of anti-gay prejudice on mental health, he was able to write about the deleterious effect on mental health of anti-Black prejudice. And Sullivan also wrote a discussion of anti-Semitism that is excellent, even if it is very pessimistic. These writings formed the groundwork which current White Institute psychoanalysts are taking even further, like Michelle Stevens, Roger Free, and Pascal Sauvert in their recent book, Culture, Politics, and Race in the Making of Interpersonal Psychoanalysis, Breaking Boundaries. Breaking boundaries is what Sullivan did. It's almost 100 years since he set up his ward at Sheppard Pratt. Will we at the White Institute celebrate that anniversary? Will we commemorate that event with a conference, with a meeting like this at least? To me, there has been a fundamental question. Do we want to embrace what we know about Sullivan's homosexuality, or do we want to keep secret what he kept secret? As far as I know, we never invited Jimmy Sullivan to speak at the White Institute. Ken Chatelain was invited to speak, but as I mentioned before, when his book came out, he was uninvited. Those were terrible lost opportunities. In 1993, a group of gay people who were members of the White Society joined together to discuss the ways that the Institute could be less discriminatory. We called ourselves something formal, the Association of Lesbian and Gay Psychoanalysts at the White Institute. Informally, we called ourselves the Gay White Way, which I believe was Bert Schaffner's idea. Our group included Gerald Perlman, Bert Schaffner, Jack Drescher, Chris Seacare, and others. We met for a year or two in the 1990s. We made some proposals to the Council of Fellows, including adding a non-discriminatory clause about sexual orientation to the White Institute's published admissions policy. We also proposed and were able to organize a meeting to welcome gay and lesbian clinicians and invite them to apply for psychoanalytic training. It took place on October 1st, 1993, on a Friday evening at the Institute. Here's the announcement of that meeting. It was well attended and announced to the world that the Institute was welcoming to gay and lesbian candidates. It was a pivotal event. I think something similar should be done today to recruit transgender psychoanalytic candidates, to show that we're welcoming and wanting to learn from transgender clinicians as well as to teach. That is why I set up a scholarship to train transgender psychoanalytic candidates. In 1999, Jack Drescher published his book, Psychoanalytic Therapy and the Gay Man. There followed then an avalanche of books edited or co-edited by Jack about many issues faced by gay men and lesbians. Gerald Perlman was running innovative groups for gay men with prostate cancer, and so he and Jack published a book on the subject. And Jack and Ann Der Cole published a book on couples therapy with gays and lesbians. In 2006, Melissa Ritter came up with a proposal for an LGBT study group. This was important in many ways. Someone not gay was saying that LGBT issues were worthy of study by all psychoanalysts. The forum proposed by Melissa was to be a scholarly exploration of the issues raised by studies of gender identity and sexual orientation. Melissa sent me her proposal. I wrote her back enthusiastically, and my enthusiasm for that group has only increased over the years. So I will let the people who have been in charge of that group speak about their work in next week's meeting. There is, of course, much more to say about homosexuality and the White Institute. I will close with a final word about the contrast between Harry Stack Sullivan and Erich Fromm, as discussed by Greenberg and Mitchell in their book, Object Relations in Psychoanalytic Theory. I love this book. It changed the landscape of psychoanalysis around the world. It did more than any other work to familiarize people with interpersonal psychoanalysis and the fundamental ways that it shaped our way of working clinically. Nevertheless, when the book came out, I was startled by the skew away from all the ways Sullivan talked about drives, including what he called zonal needs. And there was no mention of the fact that Sullivan's ward at Sheppard Pratt was a gay ward. It's understandable. Chatelain's book was published in 1981, and Greenberg and Mitchell came out in 1983. In their chapter on interpersonal psychoanalysis, Greenberg and Mitchell contrasted Sullivan and Fromm. They wrote on page 112, whereas Fromm sees adaptation to one's society as the broadest, most universal form of neurosis, Sullivan sees acculturation as the sine qua non of a fully human life. The contrast between Sullivan's belief in the impossibility of escaping the social milieu and Fromm's belief in the necessity for doing so underlies much of the divergent emphases in their versions of the relational model. Now, I can see how you can write this if you read the texts of Sullivan and Fromm. But when you look at Sullivan's actual lived life, you might say something quite different. Sullivan's life was filled with daring challenges to the norms of his culture. He established a ward for schizophrenic gay men in 1928. And that was a breathtaking departure from the norms of the social milieu at the time, and might still be so today. His attempt to revamp the selective service process was also a formidable challenge to the system. Granted, these challenges to society were limited. Sheppard Pratt ended the ward, and the military fired Sullivan. But he certainly did not follow a path of simple cultural adaptation. You could say that most of his life, Sullivan was negotiating the dialectic between his radical challenges to cultural norms, while also adapting to the prejudices of his time. His 20-year relationship with Jimmy was also a courageous violation of social norms. The adaptation side of it was that Sullivan told people Jimmy was his foster son. The daring side was that he got away with it. It's as if Sullivan said, and this is not an actual quotation from Sullivan, it's a quotation I made up. I have learned as a gay man what it is like to be defined by society as a lesser human being, not entitled to the pursuit of happiness. I found a way to get around this as much as I could, and how to help others like me to do the same. I set up a ward where gay men inclined towards psychosis could be protected from the ravages of prejudice. And I set up my private relationship with Jimmy and called him my foster son, which allowed me satisfaction and happiness for 20 years without undue interference from the world. And I have learned from this how other groups that experience prejudice can help themselves too, bucking the injustices of society in ways that are both radical and adaptive. I think that these are important facts of Sullivan's life. Will we as an institute embrace them openly or continue to try to keep them in the shadows? Thank you.